Okay, so some announcements, let's do the learning announcements first. Month of Learning sponsored by the Grunman and Birnbaum families, a memory of Rodney Grunman's Rio St. Ben Yitzchak. Week of Learning sponsored by Sophia and Edward Hamarov, Little Nishmat, Miriam Bach Mikhail. And a Week of Learning sponsored by Reza and Fred Pizov. Commemorate the 15th year side of Fred's father, Abraham Pizov, Aaron Uri Ben Mikhail, on the 18th of Mar Cheshvan. Today's breakfast is sponsored by David Heiser and myself in celebration of the Dodgers winning back-to-back World Series. And don't forget, next week on Tuesday, we have a College Lunch and Learn. The email went out on that. If you'd like to join us, please send me back a response. And there's also going to be a bagels and lox breakfast on Wednesdays, sponsored by the Bowskis. You'll get an email on that shortly. Okay, that's you wrote, and whenever you're ready.
Okay. My topic today is about burning of the Talmud. I'm going to focus on two major incidents that took place, one in 1242, I think it was, and the other one is 1555. And I was kind of inspired to do this by the talks of Rabbi Stephen Weil. You know, in Teaneck, we have something called the Beis Medrash of Teaneck, which is sponsored by Heichal Torah. On Mondays and Tuesdays, there's various shiurim given, including one on Jewish history. And they invite various distinguished people to give these talks. One of them is Rabbi Stephen Weil, who I've heard a number of times, who has, I would say, an encyclopedic memory, and he's an excellent speaker. He can speak for an hour or maybe 5 hours, which he does actually on Tisha B'Av, without any notes. He's really incredible, and he has some very
he's fantastic.
some wonderful insights. In fact, I would recommend that some of you might want to consider going there. It's open to everybody. It's free. And if I can come from Teaneck to Fairlawn, you could come from Fairlawn to Teaneck. In any event, he gave a series of 3 lectures recently on issues about medieval Jewish history, and he alluded at least to this issue with the burning of the Talmud. And I thought I'd do a little bit more research. I haven't done all that much research, but enough that I think I can give an interesting talk about what happened. So the first thing I'm going to mention is that there was a controversy regarding the Rambam. Rambam had rationalistic tendencies, and he had certain views that were set forth in the Moreh Nevuchim and in part of the beginning of the Mishnah Torah, which were considered by some people to be heretical. And in December 1233, there was a Rav by the name of Yonah of Garundi, and he opposed the Rambam. And he then contacted some Dominican friars that lived in Garundi, and obviously they had some influence. And he told them that the Rambam had written all his heretical writings, and they should be burnt. And so the friars were only too glad to oblige. And December 1233, they destroyed about 12,000 volumes of Hebrew literature, including these offensive writings of the Rambam. It doesn't appear that there was any burning of the Talmud in 1233 here, but the precedent had been set. If a book is heretical, you burn it. So that's the beginning here, and it was only another step along to burn the Talmud. So the next thing is that we have this guy by name of Nicholas Donin, He was well known as a anti-Semite. He did a tremendous amount of harm to the Jews. He was an apostate. He grew up Jewish in a place called La Rochelle in France. And in 1225, he was excommunicated by Rabbi Yechiel of Paris because he had cast doubts about the validity of the Talmud. 10 years later, it seems, he converted to Christianity. It appears that it took him 10 years from the time that he was excommunicated to his decision to convert to Christianity. And since, of course, he knew Hebrew, he had studied the Talmud, he translated 35 passages from the Talmud that he claimed were either distorted the words of Tanakh, that the Agadas were disgraceful representations of God, and it was filled with abuse against Jesus and Mary, and it taught that it was a meritorious action to kill the best man among the Christians, and it's lawful to deceive Christians. You know, there are some things in the Gemara that could be read that way. So he translated these things and then brought this before Pope Gregory IX. And the other thing which he said, and this is true, that he asserted that Jews had elevated the oral law to the level of divinely inspired scripture, and that this impeded the possibility of their conversion to Christianity. Now, again, it's very interesting. In those days, the Christians had a very simplistic approach to learning, and most of them were illiterate. And even if you wanted to learn something, the Christians don't have anything comparable to the Gemara. You have the Bible. And how do you learn what the Bible says? You listen to the priest. The priest tells you what the Bible says and what the, halacha is in Christianity. And that's the end of it. There's no study. There's no dialectical method. So it's just a simple reading of the Bible. Well, if you do that, you can read the Bible and find some passages of the Bible that might in some way be read to predict that Jesus is the Messiah. And the Christians actually believed that the Jews would fall for that. And yeah?
I understand. I think they have like certain versions of the Bible. So they can, compare the different versions and come up with
it could be. I will mention later regarding the New Testament or the Gospels. There are various accounts there which are contradictory to each other, and but the point is that even today, as far as I'm aware, Christianity doesn't have anything like the Gemara, and then certainly not. Most people were illiterate, and the comment was made that if you study the Gemara, then you're going to fully understand everything and realize that Jesus is nothing. But so therefore we have to burn the Gemara, because if we just look at the Bible, you might convince the Jews to convert. But anyway, okay, so in June 1239, the Pope issued orders that the bishops in France should confiscate all the Talmuds. And there were other letters sent out. He said went to the King of Portugal and other places, in England, Spain. But the only actual action was taken by the King of France. And so what he did was, to start off, he had a disputation. And there were a number of these disputations that took place around in the Middle Ages. They all were completely rigged, totally unfair. In most cases, the Jews would say, well, you can defend yourself, but you can't say anything bad about Christianity. And once they try to say something, they would be told, shut up, we don't want to hear from you. And of course, we're right, you're wrong. They were totally rigged. In fact, he was just talking about one disputation which involved the Ramban. And there, the king gave the Ramban the opportunity to say anything he wanted, and he did. And the thing ended after 3 days because the Ramban had the upper hand there because he was actually given the opportunity to talk. But most of them, they were not. And there were 4 rabbis, including Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who was well known, and Moshe Kutzi, known as the Sman, and 2 other rabbis were commanded by the king to hold a disputation with Donin to either refute the imputations at level against the Talmud or to make confession of the alleged abuse against the Christian religion and the blasphemies against God. So at the end of 3 days, which took place in the presence of the Queen Mother and some other dignitaries, the commission, which had been appointed to make the inquiry, of course, condemned the Talmud to be burned. They had enough of this and they said it needs to be burned. That was never carried out. The reason was that the Archbishop of Sens, who had great influence with the king, interceded on behalf of the Jews. But then, very soon afterwards, the Archbishop suddenly died. And that was interpreted by some of the Christians. This was a signal from God that the king is right and the Archbishop was wrong. So then, in any event, on June 17th, 1242, which was Erev Shabbat Parshas Chukas, 24 cartloads of books were brought together in one spot in Paris, I think in front of the city hall, and they were burned. This was the first official public burning of the Talmud. It's estimated that these 24 carts contained 10,000 volumes of Hebrew manuscripts, again, the Talmud and I guess some others too. And you have to remember, in those days, there was no printing press. So each of these had to be written out by hand, and it was a terrible tragedy. Rabbi Weil, when he mentioned this, said, if this happened today, all you have to do is drive down New Jersey Turnpike to Archibald's printing press and tell them, print 10,000 more copies of the Talmud. And it would still be take a while to do, but it could easily be done. In those days, it couldn't easily be done, and people didn't have a Gemara to study from. So it was really, really a terrible tragedy. And one of the people who was there, who witnessed this event, was a Maharam of Württemberg. And he wrote a Kina Shali Samufa Ba'esh to commemorate this event, which he, on the one hand, it also refers to the burning of the Beis HaMikdash, but he compared the 2 events, the burning of the Beis HaMikdash and the burning of these Gemaras, because they both had tragic effects on the Jewish people. Now we've got Yonah Garundi is still around, and he now realizes what he had done by telling the Dominican friars to burn the works of the Rambam that he didn't like. It's now spread, and they're burning the Gemara, and he realized he had done a terrible thing, and he tried to do tshuva, and he apparently made an attempt to go to the kever of the Rambam. It's not clear if he ever got there, but he turned from being a critic of the Rambam to quoting the Rambam wherever he spoke to try to do tshuva for what he had done, and because he now realized the terrible effect of the burning of the Rambam that he had instigated. So there were other burnings in 1250 and 1255, and the result is that French Jewry never regained its status. Remember, the Rashi grew up in France. That was a very important Jewish center, and Rashi lived there. But now it declined, and when you think about what happened after 1200s, we have the centers in Germany, in Poland, elsewhere, but not in France. Now, the next pope was called Innocent IV. He at first continued the Pope Gregory's policy against the Talmud, and he had asked the regent doctor of the University of Paris to condemn the Talmud. And then there was a guy by the name of Odo of Shadow Roog, or something like that. And he translated 1,922 passages from the Talmud that he claimed were blasphemous or objectionable for some reason, and it's called the Excerpts from the Talmud. Again, he complained not only does the Talmud contain blasphemous remarks, but it also that the Jews place greater reliance on the Talmud than on the Bible, which, as I mentioned, is true, because if you just look at the Torah, you can't interpret it, explain it without having the Gemara. Like he says, what does that mean? You put something that's colored yellow and it's a circle on your head? Obviously not. We have a Masorah of what that means, and that's how we interpret the halacha. So it's essential that we have the Gemara. And again, remember, in those days you did have the Rambam, but we didn't have all the other codes that were written afterwards. So the Gemara was still, even for halacha l'maisa, an important thing to study. So now this is the 1200s. Now we move to the 1500s. By the 1500s, we already had printing. Gutenberg had invented printing in the mid-1400s, and Venice became a center of the printing industry. And of course, this made books much more accessible to everybody, and especially to the Jews. And there also was a relatively liberal attitude during this period, where the Jewish students attended Italian universities, and there was a great demand for printing. Venice was a center of learning, but the government did not allow the Jews to set up printing presses. Venice had discriminated against the Jews. They required them to wear yellow garments and hats wherever they went out into public. In 1515, Venice forced all the Jews to live into an island that was called the ghetto. Apparently, the word ghetto was originally the name of this island in Venice, and where the Jews were forced to live. And that's where the word ghetto comes from. Of course, it's extended to mean anywhere where Jews are forced to live in cramped conditions. And they were locked in there each night. And of course, they couldn't serve on the government, etc. So there was a great demand for Jewish works to be printed. And a guy by the name of Daniel Bomberg, who was actually fairly well known, who was not Jewish, came from Antwerp. And apparently the Jews were not allowed to have their own printing presses. So he came there and got permission from the city to open up a printing press that would specialize in Jewish Hebrew works. He moved to Venice, and in 1515, apparently he had to pay a bribe to the officials, but he was granted approval to establish this printing press. He hired 4 Jewish assistants and started setting type on his press for various Jewish books. First book that he printed was Mikros Gedolos, which is Tanakh with various important mefarshim. He then went on to print the Gemaras, the Talmud. His books were of very high quality. He used only the finest ink and paper. And as a result, many Jewish households wanted to get his books. And although there were other printing presses in Italy at the time, his press in Venice became synonymous with the Jewish publishing industry, and he set a standard that other presses tried to follow. So even though he was very successful, there were other non-Jewish businessmen who then came and tried to emulate what he was doing. And they tried to set up printing presses. And the first one was a guy by the name of Marco Antonio Justiniani. He set up a press in 1545 in Venice. And he was competing with and hostile to Bomberg. So he started printing the same books that Bomberg did. And he even tried to, he adopted this logo, quoting from Navi Chagai, Godol yeh kvod bayis hazeh mi kvod bayis harishon, or something like that, where basically it was Chagai was talking about the Beis Hamikdash, but he was using this to say, my printing press is going to be better than yours. And then there were others too. They put Bomberg out of business, and they routinely undercut each other and print the same volumes that each one had done. And they all hired, of course, Jewish or apostate workers, people who said to type how to know Hebrew. That just as an aside, today we have the issue, and when you have cemetery monuments, the letters have to be engraved. And the people who do the engraving don't know Hebrew. And when you have a monument, each Hebrew letter is assigned a number. And these people just know the number, 4, 16, 3, 8. And sometimes mistakes are made that way because they have no idea what they're doing. But if you want to do it right, you've got to get somebody that really knows Hebrew. And of course, either Jews or, in some cases, people who had converted to Christianity but grew up as Jews, knew Hebrew, and were hired as workers here. So one of these people that came in to compete was a guy by the name of Alvis Bragadin. And he founded a press called Stamparia Bragadina. And one of the first books that he published was the Mishnah Torah by the Rambam. And he approached Rav Meir Katzenelbo, great Rav, who lived in Padua. And he had written a perush on the Rambam. And he gave this guy Bragadin consent to publish his own perush in this version of the Rambam that he's going to be publishing. And not only that, he also contributed some of his own money to finance the printing. Of course, it was very expensive to set the type in those days. They didn't have scanners, and everything had to be done manually with wooden type, and you had to invest a lot of money to get the type set up, and then you print the books and hopefully recoup your expenses from the sales of the books. And so Meir Katzenelbo was well known, and people wanted to get Rambam with his perush, so it was very successful. And then comes Justiniani, this other guy, and he decides to print the Mishnah Torah with Rabbi Katzenelbo's commentary. And here, he had no permission to do that. The commentary, the Rav had authorized Bragadin to do it, but not Justiniani. And he didn't put the name in, but he just copied the whole thing. And then he priced his books lower than the Bragadins. And so everybody started buying the Justiniani ones and not the Bragadin ones. So now the mayor of Katzenelbo contacted the Ramah. Ramah lived in Krakow, some distance away, but he agreed to come and adjudicate this. He was apparently his cousin. And after hearing everything, he issued a tshuva, a ruling, which is memorialized in a tshuva. And the bottom line is that he said that Bragadin had, no, not Bragadin, Justiniani had violated the halacha. Now, it's kind of interesting. I just looked at this tshuva. Maybe I'll talk about it at another time at greater length. It's Siman Yud of Tshuvas Haramah. Most tshuvas start with an explanation somebody came to me and they did such and such, and they claimed such and such did this, and this, we have this question, and so we don't, what is halacha? And this one doesn't start that way. It starts with a whole treatise of the Sheva Mitzvos B'nai Noach, and what do they mean, and how are they binding on the Goyim? And the Ramah concludes, one of the Sheva Mitzvos is Gezel, right? Goyim can't do Gezel. So what does Gezel mean? He says, Gezel means what the halacha says is Gezel. The Goyim have to obey the halacha when it comes to Gezel. Therefore, this printer violated the halacha. Okay, well, that's great, except that Ramah can't tell the printer what to do. He then goes on to say, because of this, no Jew is allowed to buy these books. He has a cherem against Jews buying the books from the competitor. And that Ramah, of course, was very well respected, and he imposed, he's actually a term nachash. He beat on nachash v'chai. It's a pasuk from the Chumash, but nachash actually stands for nidoi cherem and shamta. It's a kind of interesting acronym there. So he had promulgated this cherem and was adhered to. Okay, so now we got the two goyim who are printers, and they're both, or at least one of them is put into a difficult position because of what the Ramah did. So what do? You go to the church and you tell the church, oh, you know, so-and-so printed Talmud. Oh, you know, the Talmud contains all these blasphemies. So we've got to stop this. So again, we have an investigation, and they appointed in 1553, they appointed a committee of 6 cardinals, led by a guy by the name of Gian Pietro Carafa. And he offered, they investigated, determined, of course, the Talmud is blasphemous, and they ordered the confiscation of all copies of the Talmud in Rome through a house-to-house search, and anybody found hiding this would be imprisoned. And then on Rosh Hashanah, 15.
Simple question. We said it before that they weren't allowed to print. To take them to have this problem from the time that they started to do Jewish book printing till this whole issue came to the point.
It was, they started in 1550, well, at least in Venice, in Italy, it started in 1550. The work, that was not.
So was it 3 years and then everything?
No, we're now talking about 1553. It was a period of about 40 years before that the books were burned. There were 40 years.
Now it's coming to a problem now that the non-Jews now make problems. So how many years is it from the time that they started to print till this point?
It's something like 40 years,
40
I
years,
think. Yeah. Because at first you had Bomberg, and I have not done extensive research exactly when these other guys came in. Because Bomberg apparently was around for quite a number of years and printed quite a bit of stuff. Then these guys came 30, 40 years later. That's what it seems. So on Rosh Hashanah in 1553, they burnt all the Talmuds that they had found in an enormous bonfire in the Campo di Fiori public square in Rome. A few weeks later, they had one of these things in Bologna, and then in Venice. They built an enormous fire in the Piazza of San Marco in Venice and burnt the Gemaras there. And then they issued a prohibition against printing any more Jewish books in Venice. And again, this had a tremendous negative effect on the Jewish life in Italy. They forbade printing Talmud for quite a while there, and then they allowed it only if it was expurgated of all of its passages that were considered offensive Christianity. The name Talmud was not used, and they had to delete Maseches Avodah Zarah because that was, clearly anti-Christian, right? So, and the result is that Italy never again became a major Jewish center. Yes, there were Jews in Italy, but the major Jewish centers became Poland and Salonika, other places where the Jews may have been discriminated against in certain ways, but for the most part, there was no prohibition against printing. Again, there may have been censorship and other anti-Semitic things, but the Jews could live there until the Nazis came and destroyed all those communities. But
Rabbi Sachs points out in a couple of places that because of the printing of the Talmud in various places over history, that's why you had Christian Zionists today, because they learned the Gemara, they learned the Talmud, they learned the book sometimes better than we learned. And they knew what, and so you see that's why even in this country, this whole movement of Zionism, because our Constitution starts off with the people. It's sort of the idea of
Doesn't the Vatican have copies of Barbara and everything?
yeah.
oh yeah,
They studied them in England. In England, the Calvinists, that's why you see such influence here of the Bible so much because they spread it around. And it started off with the printing of even though they burned it and everything else in some places didn't defame it, and that's in the same sense.
Okay, I'll close by mentioning another interesting, very sad footnote to this whole thing. I mentioned that the burning of the Talmud in 1553 was orchestrated by the group that was the cardinal led by this guy, Gian Pietro Carafa. And he soon after he became the Pope. And he was extremely anti-Semitic. And he issued a bull, meaning an order, which was entitled Cum Nimis Absurdum. And the beginning of it, it says, since it is absurd and utterly inconvenient that the Jews, who through their own fault were condemned by God to eternal slavery, can, under the pretext that pious Christians must accept them, be so ungrateful to Christians. Instead of thanking him for their gracious treatment, they return contumely and they manage to claim superiority. And so he then issues an order that restricting the Jews of Rome to a ghetto and requiring them to wear this pointed yellow hat and other things like that. And of course, we consider this absurd, but in a very different way than he did. And interestingly, this Pope Paul IV was hated not only by the Jews, but also by Catholics. When he died a few years later, when he was almost ready, his deathbed and about ready to die, crowds of people gathered in a central square, began rioting. And then he had a statue of himself erected in this plaza. And they put a yellow hat on top of the statue. and then after a mock trial, they decapitated the statue and threw it into the river. The modern historians tend to view his papacy as an especially poor one. He's been called the worst pope of the 16th century. So this is a guy who ordered all the Jewish books to be burned. And so I thought these two incidents would be kind of interesting. The only thing that happened afterwards that I'm aware of is, of course, the Nazis also burnt some Jewish books. But from what I understand, the burning of the Talmud and stuff like that took place only in Poland. They tried to totally obliterate any remnant of the Jewish community and then just put it in a museum. But anyway, these two incidents of burning the Talmud did have a major impact on Jewish history. And I thought it'd be interesting to learn about it.
Yashikova, thank you.
You're welcome. How do I turn this off? Meeting. Guess you gotta wait for,
So
mhm.
we can do that today. That's good. It's. So what do you
Gotta turn this off.
I saw it, so we did everything. $220 later. That was expensive.
No, I go there and sometimes we find that they're not as cheap as they in big sale.
I've only
Yeah,
had
but you
lots
know
of
what? It's a
big
platter. Like this.
Right.
I mean, it's like, she said it's a whole like 12 pieces of chicken.
Big John,
Okay, so that's gotta be heavy, and I wanted to.
he said with
A
a
rib.
love.
It's not terrible.
No, that really isn't.
Shabbat with the Baruch
On
atah.
Amazon.
But that's in bulk. Well,
It's like 100 plates and 100. Yeah, 100. We can do a deal.
Amen.
you get the paper and you get the knife.
Amen.
translation.
I told you the story with my Facebook that she's
I'm always reading this stuff. I should have.
cheap, China, but it was nice. And for a while I used it, and then I said, this is crazy. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I'm washing dishes. Okay. So every year I would pack it, and every year I would unpack it and not use it. Finally, I just said, all right, I'm not gonna unpack it. I'm confused when I moved. Why? I don't know. Finally, we said, let me just like this one list. No, okay, so I posted on my Facebook link or something, or on, who claims it? My daughter.
No, very good.
I
Very
didn't
interesting.
spend much time preparing this, as I did, but it's fascinating to read this. I mean, terrible things that happen, but it's interesting to learn about.
You know what, over the years, in terms, you say about burning Gemaras, but all the people that, all the Jewish people that got killed, that is unbelievable. That's the reason why we're so small today. If you would go through all the times, the amount of Jewish people that got killed today would be a much bigger nation. No, but they said, I heard this rabbi, can't remember his name right now, but he talked about the time with the Romans that went through. It was a period where they said 2/3 of the Jewish population were wiped out.
I saw your lovely wife. I saw your lovely wife driving down.
Yes.
On the way to work.
Same place for you, different places.
I usually, well, it depends. If I'm getting fresh bagels from here, because I get bagels from Restaurant Depot.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Today you got a fresh bagel, right?
Yeah.
Delicious, absolutely delicious.
Well, I won the contest when we did the contest,
Okay.
but